to this anniversary of the First International. We are talking a little bit about the book that I edited a few years ago, Workers Unite, that was very successful, I must say, translated in several languages. This year was translated into French and Spanish. The book was published in 2014 on the 150th anniversary of the International. And since then, it came out in many different editions. In 2014, the book was published simultaneously at the same time in English, Italian, and Portuguese. And then there were several abridged editions in India, in Tamil, in Telugu, and many other languages. But this is just an example of the interest that we have for the international, and many other translations are forthcoming soon. For example, next year, the Japanese one. I think that... yes.
This is the Telugu version of the introduction by Professor Marcello for this book. We have published, some of our comrades published it into Telugu.
Yes, exactly. Why this book was so widely translated and circulated so much? I think that one of the main reasons, as I will try to explain later, or responding to questions or during the debate, is that the set of writings of the First International that we are celebrating today on the occasion of its 158th anniversary, well, it's very, very big, because we are talking about an organization that had several congresses. And today I'm going to quickly recall the history of the main stages of the First International. And then there are all the debates that took place in the General Council of the First International in London, where Marx was also based. So all this makes thousands of pages, and it is usually very difficult to read the International, very difficult to have a sense of the main decisions of the International, the main debates, because it was very dispersive. Also, some of these texts were just published in French, because most of the Congress took place in Switzerland, in Belgium, and also because of the struggle between Marxist tradition and anarchist tradition, right? So we should not forget that there was a split at the end of the International, and for a few years, as I will tell you at the end of my talk, there is the Marxist International and the Anarchist International. So it is complicated to read all this document and to make sense of all of them. So what I tried to do in 2014 and still today in our discussions and debate was an attempt to systematize all these documents and divide them in 13 different topics, so that you can see the evolution of the International, and from 1864, the year of its foundation, to the end of the International at the middle of the 70s. And also you can see on how many topics the International had a lot to say. Because we live in a period that thinkers like Karl Marx or, political organization, trade union organization are wrongly represented for, a political goal, like organization or thinkers that only were able to talk about the conflict between capital and labor. While on the contrary, something that I am trying to do with my work is demonstrate how much these thinkers and this organization thought about, ecology, gender issues, many questions that are at the center of our political agenda today. So after this short introduction about my work and about my book, Workers Unite, And after thanking once again you for inviting me and my discussant to be here with me today, I would like to return for a second, for a couple of minutes, let's say, to the 28th of September of 1864 in London, because there was a very big meeting there with 2,000 workers coming from mostly France and England, and differently from, this ideological, from the propaganda that was very strong in the 20th century, that represented the International like a very revolutionary organization and represented Marx like the head of the International. At the very beginning, actually, the first International was a mild organization of the working class. The main groups, the British Trade Union and mostly the French, who were following the ideas of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who was a very strange kind of anarchist in France, very moderate from some point of view. They were actually asking for fraternity and union among people of different countries. And the idea at the beginning of the International was also to express solidarity for Poland, that was under an occupation at the time. At the time, the Polish question was a little bit like the question of Palestine today in our days. So I would say that there is a mild, moderate ideology at the beginning of the International, generically democratic, with a lot of ethical, humanitarian topics. And I would say that very few political leaders or radical activists of the time would understand what the International became in that meeting on the 28th of September 1864. One of them was Karl Marx, because he was quickly able to understand that there was the potential in this organization to rebuild, to give once again strength to the labor movement. Let me just open a very short parenthesis to tell you that after 1849, the revolution, these 2 years of revolution in Europe, 1848-49, were defeated, and Marx himself was forced to move to London in exile, away from Germany, Belgium, France, all countries that, kicked Marx outside their territories. So when Marx is talking about the International at the very beginning of this experience to Engels, he was able to see the potential, as I said, of this organization. Engels, on the contrary, was a little bit scared that this organization will just delay the publication of Capital, because Marx is still writing Capital Volume 1 that he started in, let's say, 1857 with the Grundrisse, the first draft, and published only 3 years after the beginning of the International in 1867. But Marx was able to convince Engels that what we call today the first organization, actually the International Association of Working Men, was the place to be, and was the only place that could give once again strength to labor movement after more than 15 years of defeat from 1848 to 1864. So the International was at the beginning made by different tendencies. One of them, as I said, I would say the most relevant, the bigger component of the International was British trade unionism. They were not against capitalism, or they were not attacking capitalism, but they wanted to use the International in order to avoid that labor force from other countries were imported in England while when they were doing strikes. So this is why the British trade unionism, wanted to establish this sort of alliance between different groups, different movements, in the European countries. Then, as I said, there is this tendency in France, following Proudhon. The mutualism is the name of this group of French activists. Around Marx, there is a group of communists, of anti-capitalists, but it's much smaller than these two groups that I mentioned before, mutualism and British trade unionism. And then in London at the time, there were many radical Democrats who were former leaders in their countries, like, I don't know, Mazzini in Italy, or from other countries like Hungary, fighting for the independence of their country. So they were trying to use the International like an organization to promote the fraternity among European people. There were also many utopians. This is another group that I must mention, like, groups that were still following the ideas of, I don't know, Saint-Simon, Fourier, Owen, but in a very sectarian way. And then in and out the International, there were the Lassallian. So in 1863, the German Social Democratic Party was established in Germany, and there was a very big component that was very, very moderate, as you would say, and by no means internationalism. So they conceive politics like something that you do in your country. So with this many tendencies that I just overviewed very quickly, very superficially to you, you can understand how important was the role of Karl Marx. Because Marx was able to put together all these tendencies to avoid, at least, in this first phase, splits in the organization, and also to give a clear goal to this organization, an anti-capitalist goal. Marx wrote all the main resolutions of the International. Marx was able to make the International a radical movement, but at the same time a non-sectarian movement. That's very, very important. And he was also able to explain the importance of the connection between the economical struggle and the political struggle. So, and of course, as I mentioned before, to think and to act on international scale. But I would also like to say very quickly, this is not a conference about Marx, but of course we should mention the most relevant leader of this International, that Marx himself learned a lot from the International. So Marx learned, for example, from the many strikes, spontaneous many times, of workers in Europe. And this was a big help for the making of the political program of labor movement. Marx learned a lot from the revolutionary experience of the Paris Commune that happened during the International in 1871. And also, I believe that Marx learned a lot by this being able to keep together a political organization. So I usually look at Marx not only like a scholar who learned in the British Museum reading books, but also organizing as a political activist and organizer. The International was once again very different from what many conservatives said at the time, and many communists represented later in the 20th century. Both these groups, the first one because they wanted to repress the International, the second one because they wanted to create a myth, a legend around the International, both represented this organization like something huge with millions of members. Some people said there are 2.5 million, there are 5 million of members. But actually, we know that the International was a very small organization that put together sometimes unions and sometimes, spontaneously organized groups. There were no parties at the time. The experience of the German social democracy is an anomaly at the time. And I must say that workers did not subscribe directly to the International. This was very rare. Usually their organization joined the International, and sometimes also in a very complicated way, because Marx and the General Council had to convince them to follow their political line. The General Council, this is already the second time that I mentioned this. It's a very important, but once again, a small core center of the International, where every week, once a week, for 385 times, the main leaders of the International who were in London met regularly in order to discuss about the condition of the working class, the introduction of machinery, what this produced on the working class, the strikes to organize, the role and the importance of trade unions, questions of international politics, but also questions like, the Irish question, or just thinking about how to build the socialist society, communist society. So there is a very significant making of this organization that took place weekly. And then later, all of a sudden, the International became very big, very important after the Paris Commune. So chronologically, it's very difficult to divide different stages of the International. In my book, I try to do this, but dividing at least two different things from the point of view of the organization of the International. Well, there is the birth of the International in 1864, and then I would say a first period of the making of organization until the Congress of Geneva in 1866, so where this organization is growing. And then there is a moment of development, I would say between 1866 and 1870, followed by a revolutionary phase that, as I mentioned before, started with the Paris Commune in 1871, and then the crisis, the end of the International, the fight between anarchists and communists. This took place very significantly between 1872 and 1877. From the political point of view, so far I mentioned from the point of view of the making of the organization, I would say that there are the first debates at the beginning, so how to build, how to connect these different components, as I mentioned before. Then there is a period between 64 and 65. Then there are 3-4 years of conflict between collectivist and mutualist. Collectivist is the group where Marx and other revolutionary were located, and the mutualists are, on the contrary, these followers of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. And then there is the fight between centralist and autonomist. This is something that is related to the struggle between communists and anarchists. So the idea that the International should have a center, a very well-organized center, or from the point of view of the autonomist, many different sections that also might have many different political point of views. So one of the questions, and now I'm going to the second part of my presentation very quickly as much as I can. One of the questions that I want to present today are the main topics discussed at the time of the International. And one of them was the role of the state. In the conference, in the Geneva conference in 1866, there is this first debate about the state, like mutualists were against any kind of participation to the states, while questions like how to implement in the entire country I don't know, changes like forbid that children had to work was something that was achievable only by taking the state and by forcing the state to forbid this as a national bill. So not only as a struggle in a particular factory. So this question of the state from now on will be at the center of the debates of the international. And as you can imagine, or you already know, it is also one of the reasons of the end of the international, one of the main differences between Marxism and anarchism. Trade unions is another important topic. There are many debates about trade unionism because Marx was trying to push trade unions to, of course, take care of the struggle, of the everyday struggle, but also to push more for a struggle, a more political struggle, I would say, against capitalism, and not only a small struggle as they were doing at the time. So this is a critique that was moved to labor movement at the time. Strikes were very important in this period, and actually the strikes were significant in order to help the General Council and Karl Marx to move from this impasse of the these positions like mutualists were against the strike and Lassallians, the German Social Democratic, were against the strike, while on the contrary, British unions and communists were in favor of this. So there were many strikes at the time, and it was the task of the workers themselves. They achieved in convincing these sectors of the international that were skeptical about strikes that they were absolutely essential for achieving any emancipation for the working class. So from this point of view, particularly 66, 67, the strike is no longer questioned, and it entered at the center of the labor movement. In the Congress of Lausanne, the one that took place 1 year after in 1867, there is another topic that enters in the debate of the international very strongly, thanks to César de Pep, a very important leader of the international coming from Belgium. And this topic is war, the one that we are discussing very much, unfortunately, once again nowadays. So de Pep is writing a resolution with many other activists. And in this documents, in this debates, in this resolution, there is the idea that war is not something that is happening because of king is taking a decision, because there is a crazy person in power. War is happening because of capitalism. War is happening because there are unbalanced relationship in the economical system, and this brings country to make the war. So capitalism is connected to war, and this is the beginning of a very long tradition that had, after this resolution of the First International, many leaders of socialist, communist tradition. To mention only one, I will say Rosa Luxemburg, that placed the importance of capitalism in the explanation of war. 1 year after Lausanne and 2 years after Lausanne, there were two congresses, the one in Brussels, 1868, and in Basel, once again in Switzerland, in 1869, that were very relevant for the international because they moved actually the majority of the international from mutualism to collectivism, as I mentioned before. And from now on, the collectivization of land and the collectivization of the means of production became an essential part of the political program of labor movement. I'm saying this, I want to make it this clear. So not only these questions are written in books of revolutionary theorists at the time, but they are actually indicated in the program of a big transnational organization. And ecology is another topic that is also touched in this period, because it is clear that capitalism is not only dangerous for human beings, but is also dangerous for the entire world, for nature. And that's why they said that it is completely crazy to give forest and nature in the hands of single individual with private property. The Congress of the International says that this should belong to the society, to the collectivity, and not to individuals and to capitalism. So there is a first step toward ecology that the labor movement is taking at the time. Very quickly, I'm going to jump to 1871. As I mentioned before, there is Paris Commune at the time, and this international is usually represented like an organization that pushed the Paris Commune to start, right? I don't think so. It is actually the opposite. And Marx was very, very cautious. For example, he was very scared that times were not ready for the revolution to start. And perhaps, as we have seen, he was right from this point of view. But the Paris Commune was very important because it, despite the fact that, as you know, it was not even able to last for 3 months, it created a lot of enthusiasm in labor movement. In many countries, workers said, we have to do like in Paris. There were dozens of new newspapers published by working class organization and new forms of association. So the Paris Commune demonstrated the importance of political organization and new forms of association. So from this point of view, I would say that the labor movement is not only thinking about the program for the future, but fighting immediately for a goal that they saw it was achievable, as the workers in Paris demonstrated in 1871. There is also the question of the political party. So as you will see, some of the issues that belong to the history of labor movement, of socialism, of communism, actually they started in this period. That's why this was called the First International. And once again, they started not only because they were written in a book written by Marx or by Bakunin or by Proudhon, but because they were discussed in a political organization and because they became part of the political program of a political organization, a transnational political organization. And one of the main achievements that was also a complicated topic was the need of an autonomous political party for the labor movement. This is something that Marx and Blanqui, they both thought it was indispensable for labor movement. And this is also the beginning of the struggle with Bakunin. I don't know if there are questions, debate, we can talk about this. But this is the center of the conference that took place in London in 1871. So demonstrating that there is the need to, I would say, accompany the struggle, the economic struggle, the struggle for the end of exploitation with the political struggle, the struggle to take the power. And actually, in 1872, at the last real Congress of the First International, because after this Congress there was a split, and actually already in this Congress there were many people who decided not to go. For example, the Italian delegation to the Congress. there was the end of this experience that was short, like only 8 years from 1864 to 1872, but very significant. So first of all, let me tell you, and I'm going to the final part of my presentation now, the differences in the international between 1872 and 1864. In 1872, the international is an anti-capitalist organization. All these moderate tendencies that I described at the beginning of my talk, or these Democrats, they had abandoned, they had left the international, and actually also the mutualists were much less important than the anti-capitalists in the international. So one change is related to this, is that this is an organization that is much more radical than a year before. One other change is that workers are now organizing themselves not because of the ideologies or the sects that they belong. Like I mentioned at the beginning, followers of Fourier, followers of Lassalle. So now there is a more direct organization of workers, and let's say the beginning, a very complicated beginning of fusion between different tendencies. There are also external changes, and one of them is the beginning of nationalism and the making of big countries like Italy 1861, Germany 1865. So these are changes that, of course, made very difficult for many activists to conceive an organization whose center is in London, and from London there are the indications what to do in different countries. So, and also now the working class is much more organized. There are trade unions that are legal and no longer illegal in many countries. There are strikes that are replaced in blood, but this is the beginning of a process of legalization of that took more time, years, and in some countries decades, but still there. And there are also political parties that are starting to grow up, to being created. So now the International has a new mission, and this new mission is created around this political party, this organization. And this is also one of the differences between Marx and Bakunin. One of the differences is the revolutionary subject. For Marx is the working class of the big factories, but we must also say that the International had many issues with workers of the factories. Like this was a component that they could not easily reach. And actually the most politicized workers were artisans and workers that at the time had already a level of education that, as you can imagine, unskilled workers or workers of big factories had difficulties to achieve at the time. So Bakunin is stronger in countries like Italy, like Spain, where big factories are not at the center of the working class, where there is a different composition of the working class. And Bakunin was also strong in Switzerland. So and more or less, and of course in some parts of France. This is a struggle that in the end led to the creation of two different organizations, two different international after the split. Those who remain associated and close to Marx actually moved the international to the United States, and this organization lasts for 4 more years, but it was really very, very small, and it just exists on paper. The Anarchist International, with ideas closer to the ideas of Mikhail Bakunin was a little bit more alive and a little bit stronger in terms of numbers in Europe, but they did the same path, and actually they ended as a political organization in 1877 after very few, a couple of congresses with a very small participation. And actually this was a split between anarchists and communists that lasts for a very long time, and also the other internationals, starting from the second one, did not see the joint participation of these two groups. I am at the end of my presentation. I hope I have not taken too much time. It's 38 minutes. So 2 more minutes to say that the heritage of the international, the importance of the international. Well, I will mention that this organization was able to explain, was able to help the working class, I would say, better said, help the working class to understand that there is no way to end exploitation and slavery of work in our society, no other way than the disappearance of capitalism. So this is something that the International has started to do, the first International has started to do in a very significant way. Also, the International demonstrated many times to the working class the importance of organizing a struggle not only in your own country. Like the International many times put together a little bit of money, all the money that they could take from, I don't know, for example, workers of France in order to support a strike that was taking place in England. And delegates of the International went to Ireland and Germany at the same time, convincing workers not to accept to move to England and to work while their comrades were doing a strike. So the working class saw how important this is, and they started to have this internationalist politics. They also understood, and this is the central element of the First International, that the emancipation of the working class is the task of the working class. Only the workers themselves can do this. And this is very different from many ideologies, many ideas, also inside the labor movement at the time. For example, the first proto-socialist, Claude de Saint-Simon, he thought that, thinkers should explain workers and tell workers what to do. Here with the International, there is a very strong turn toward self-emancipation, and this is also significant. And I would say that without looking at this organization, this is also an effort that I made with my book, and very short, very superficially with this presentation, without thinking that this organization was so big, so perfect as sometimes it's been represented. I told you the international problems with, the working class of the big factory, unskilled laborers, despite the fact that there were some important ideas in order to link the struggle for gender equality to class struggle. This is only the beginning, and there is a significant component of male workers that were conceiving politics with conservatives ideas in relation to gender emancipation, women's emancipation. Well, in this organization, there are many flowers that later grow and contributed significantly to the making of the political program of the labor movement. As I mentioned, and once again to overview here, the idea that the strike is essential for the labor movement was something that was conceived in this period between 1864 and 1872. Internationalism in this period, giving centrality to the opposition to war and connection to the emergence of wars with capitalism is something that happened here. And as I mentioned also at the end of my presentation, the political party, the central role of the political party in order to start a political struggle and not only economical struggle is something that also took place during the time of the First International. The time of the First International is from some point of view similar to the time that we have today in many countries in the world. So it is a little bit less similar to the Second and the Third International that saw big political organizations, big political parties, or even, countries like in the Third International after the making of Soviet Union, joining an international, right? In this case, we are talking about small groups in some countries. Still, there were no political parties. And it is a little bit similar to the, unfortunately, weakness that we have today in our world, in our time. So perhaps reading these documents, studying the experience of the First International is even more relevant today, 158 after its foundation. And I believe that it is also good for a new generation of activists to look at this experience and to see how is it possible to organize people, to organize the working class, to give a central role to education, and, to do what they did, think about a different society, an alternative, a completely alternative society to capitalism, build a coherent program, political program, and fight with this. I see the experience of the International, particularly the final years, as an organization where there is pluralism and where there is anti-capitalism. And perhaps these two words should be also at the center of our political task today, while we are rethinking about what to do with the left and how to reorganize and give new strength to our political organization today. So long live to the International, and thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Marcello. I am very much excited maybe to speak out my mind about the excellent presentation, but as I committed, and I shall suggest that at the end of the presentation by Comrade Harsev, in concluding this session, I have promised and I have been allowed to take about 5-6 minutes. So in that session, I'll try to share about your presentation and about the book and so on. And with this, with kind permission of all, I invite Comrade Harsev to make his presentation. But before that, I request Comrade Biraya as an anchor that about the timeline and other things you may kindly share with Comrade Harsev. Comrade Biraya.
Thank you, Comrade Swadesh Devrai. On behalf of Manchi Pusthakam, we have been organizing this kind of book talks as we want to carry the sense of reading, sense of importance of books to the new generation in the new formats. And in this process, we have already invited once in Professor Marcello to discuss his book on the last years of Karl Marx on our channel, along with Comrade Sitaram Yechury, General Secretary, Communist Party of India Marxist, and also Professor Vijay Prasad, Chief Editor, Left World. On the day, we assured Professor Marcello that we are going to translate the book into Telugu. And we are happy to inform the audience that the translation has been completed. And we are in the process of editing the book. So hopefully soon, by the first month of a new year, that may see the light of the day. Apart from that, and we want to thank Professor Marcello and also Harsev and Swadesh for accepting this idea of book talks. And we hope all these three personalities will be with us in our future endeavors. Before giving up to Comrade Harsev, this also happens to be an important day in terms of Indian politics as well. Not only for in terms of international politics. Just before opening up the link, me and Comrade Harsev was talking about. This the today is also the birth anniversary of Comrade Bhagat Singh, the revolutionary freedom fighter and perhaps the pioneering Marxist of India, from India, of that generation. And nobody disputes the fact that had Bhagat Singh lived through the times of attainment of freedom, India and Indian politics, and particularly left politics in India, would have been in a completely different shape. So we are also celebrating Bhagat Singh's birth anniversary, along with the foundation day of First International. With this intervention, I request Comrade Harsev to take my child.
Thank you. And thank you, Manchi, Pusthakam, and Comrade Viraya, and all those organizers of this particular presentation this evening, or this afternoon, or morning, wherever you are in the world, and inviting me to share a platform with Professor Marcello Musto. It really is indeed an honor, especially on such a grand occasion as this, the occasion of the 158th anniversary of International Working Men's Association, and of course the birth of Shaheed Azam Bhagat Singh. Both Marx and I would say, I don't know which would be lesser or greater, Bhagat Singh are my inspirations. They're my ideals. They're the people I try to follow. And really, just before I say anything else, Professor, the book itself, I read it page to page, and it is absolutely magnificent. So if any of the people listening in haven't yet acquired the book or haven't read it, please read it. It really is putting Marxism in the terms that we can understand. It's in everybody's language. It's in our language. You have simplified the matter of understanding Marxism to such an extent that I'm very happy to share it everywhere and say, look, you need to read this book. So thank you. We owe you an enormous debt of gratitude for doing this. I will certainly look forward to reading some of your other works now. This is an introduction for me to your works. You can say it's ignorance on my part, but nonetheless, I don't have any problems admitting what I haven't come across before. Really is fantastic. And what I'm going to speak about this in the next 10 minutes or so is reflections from that book. It's not something I'm making it up, but it's reflections that reflect British society then, European society, and to an extent, the international world as it was in 1864. So I'm going to keep my talk limited, but not entirely, to the trade union movement. For my background, I've done 40 years in the trade union movement here in Britain. I'm currently a trustee and the treasurer of the Marx Memorial Library and the Workers' School. So this will become part of the education there as well. We will use it and certainly look forward to inviting Professor Musto to some of the talks there for our education classes. We try to deliver this, and I'm glad that this book class, as you call it, is doing a similar exercise, because nobody's going to teach working class history, never mind the history of Marxism, to our own people. And so for that, I thank you. I'll start And I'm really sorry if there's going to be some repetition. As I said, it is really a reflection on the book because I found it so fantastically useful. Conditions for the International Working Men's Association, or as they were for the trade union movement in Britain. What we had was low wages, below subsistence, no labor rights, introduction of machinery. Today's word would be new technology with no safety implications and no planning. Emergence of mutual support, and the good professor has talked about this, the rise of cooperatives. Joint labor action coming into being where people were making common demands, leading to some minor political action with some key legislation just prior to it, the 1833 Abolition of Slavery Act. Now, for people in India, this is worth noting. While Britain abolishes the Slavery Act, a year later, they introduce indentured laborers from India in 1834. Termed coolies abroad. Coolies, obviously, in India is just railway and buses where people are loading and uploading. But you'll be surprised, or maybe not surprised, that people abroad sent from India were called coolies as well. And of course, there was the revolutionary influence from Europe with what was going on in Europe. International Working Men's Association. I'd love to say that St. Martin's Hall is still there. It's not, unfortunately. 28 September 1864, 150 years later, we tried to hold a similar meeting there. That's when we discovered it no longer exists. And we held it for Marx Memorial Library, which is an equally suitable venue because that was a venue that was frequented by Eleanor Marx, Marx's daughter. So if ever you frequent or visit London, it's one worth going to. Karl Marx was on the stage. He wasn't the founder of it, but he was on stage with no speaking role. What was the key things? And these are really wonderful, the way it comes out. All societies and individuals adhering to it, this is to the international, will acknowledge truth, justice, and morality as the basis of their conduct towards each other and towards all men with regard to color, creed, or nationality. That it acknowledges no rights without duties, no duties without rights. And you hear of this in most trade unions these days, and certainly in political parties of the left. They made a proclamation that the emancipation of the working classes must be conquered by the working classes themselves. The struggle for the emancipation of the working classes means not a struggle for class privileges and monopolies, but for equal rights and duties and the abolition of class rule. And they also outlined defense of fundamental political freedoms. Freedoms, I think, that we here in Britain and in India try to also argue for the political freedoms. What were they? The right of assembly, the right of association, and the freedom of the press, which are all under attack, whether you're in Britain or in India. And these resonate with us today as they did 150 years ago with the founders of the International. And Professor, I don't know who actually wrote it, these are your words, these are our weapons. Are we to sit back and abstain while somebody tries to rob us of them? It is said that a political act on our part implies that we accept the existing state of affairs. On the contrary, so long as this state of affairs offers us the means of protesting against it, our use of these means does not signify that we recognize the prevailing order. Now, you heard earlier on several times the abolition of classes. This was the alternative to what I would call social democrats really these days, who put forward the equalization of classes. Or sometimes they think they've actually done away with classes, as Tony Blair did in Britain. Literally interpreted, it meant come to the harmony of capital and labor. And this is preached by the bourgeois socialists today, and still something that's applied by some of the trade unions, unfortunately. It is not the logically impossible equalization of classes, but the historical necessity or necessary superseding abolition of classes, this true secret of the proletarian movement. That becomes the great aim of the International Working Men's Association that really frightened everybody around the world, including Britain. What was the experiences across Europe? No improvement of machinery, no appliance of science to production, no contrivances of communication, no new colonies, no emigration, no opening of markets, no free trade, not all these things put together will do away with the miseries of industrious masses. That was the way it was recognized. When it's just pure poetry, but it hits home. Every fresh development of productive powers or labor must tend to deepen social contrasts, and point social antagonisms. And this is something happening today. Death of starvation to the rank of an institution. During this intoxicating epoch of economical progress in the metropolis of the British Empire, this is England, London, we had pauperism, we still have poverty. And in Britain today, we got anti-poverty schemes going on up and down the country with this cost of living crisis, as they call it today. We had famines in that period soon. In Ireland, we had the Bengal famine created by the British colonialism. We had famines in Africa. That epoch is marked in annals of the world by the quickened return, the widening compass, and the deadlier effects of the social pest called commercial industrial crisis. A precursor to the crisis of capitalism of 2008. Similar crises were happening then, just different words. Discoveries of new gold lands led to an immense exodus, leaving an irreparable void in the ranks of the British proletariat. And I'm sure you can understand where they went to. What was the starting point? It wasn't the 8-hour those days. It was a 10-hour bill. And what was the action and reaction? Most of the European continental governments had to accept the English Factory Act in more or less modified forms, and the English Parliament itself is every year compelled to enlarge its sphere of action. What's the reaction? Employers threatened to bring over Frenchmen, Germans, Belgians, and others to do the work of workers in Britain at a reduced rate of wages. Again, happening today. Not from any desire on the part of the continental brethren to injure the British working class, but through regular and systematic communication between the industrial classes of all countries. The international aim was to bring up the wages of the ill-paid to as near level as possible with that of those who are better remunerated, and not to allow employers to play one off against another, and so drag us down to the lowest possible condition, what we in the trade union movement say the lowest common denominator, through divide and rule. The International aroused passions all over Europe. It made class solidarity a shared ideal and inspired large numbers of men and women to struggle for the most radical of goals, changing the world, or as we term it, transformation of society and the world of socialism. Trade unions and Marx. Well, Marx really summed up British trade unions, and unfortunately they haven't shifted a great deal. Majority of them haven't. There are a few who are exceptions to this. British trade unions as the central driving force of the International, with significant membership, around 50,000, whose leaders, nearly all reformist in their worldview, were mainly interested in economic questions. They fought to improve the workers' conditions, but without calling capitalism into question. They saw the International, as the professor has described already, as an instrument for preventing the import of manpower from abroad in the event of strikes. Karl Marx linked the economic and political struggle to each other, which the trade unions have still failed to do, and made international thinking and international action an irreversible choice. Trade unions, as the champions and representatives of the whole working class, they must look carefully after the interest of the worst paid trades. And on this point, I would say the CITU, whose representative is here today, and members of the World Federation of Trade Union do try to stick to that particular guidance that was made as an instruction from the International and some of the congresses that followed. Karl Marx went on to say, the trade unions are too exclusively bent upon the local and immediate struggles with capital, and didn't yet fully understand their power of acting against the system of wage slavery itself. They kept themselves aloof from general social and political movements. And he said they ought not to forget that they're fighting with effects, but not with the causes of those effects, that they're retarding the downward movement, but not changing its direction, that they're applying palliatives, but not curing the malady. In other words, providing relief, but not getting rid of the illness itself. They ought to understand that with all the miseries it imposes upon them, the present system simultaneously engenders the material conditions and the social forms necessary for an economical reconstruction of society. And this is something, comrades and friends, you will find is still on many trade union banners today, and their slogan, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. And it was in the Labour Party conference just concluded yesterday. A fair, greener society. What do they mean by fair? And Marx actually said they ought to inscribe on their banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wages system. So whenever you see this banner with fair day's words, we need to question it, that actually it should be abolition of wages, get rid of the wage slavery. And I'll got a couple more minutes and I'll conclude. Women's rights and machinery. When we did this 150-year anniversary, one of the questions that was posed was on the question of women, and say, why does it say International Men's Association, International Working Men's Association? Why not women? Why not people? Why not humans? There's a lot written by the professor in this wonderful book, so I would recommend that you actually read it for yourselves. But it goes into some detail that ancient religions considered work a punishment today. Today, man sees in work his true destiny. Work then becomes a sacred right that cannot be denied to anyone. Woman can therefore claim this right by the same token as men, since only in work will she find independence and dignity. There's a small chapter on this, so I would recommend people read in detail. What is it that we need to understand? The International Working Men's Association should promote the development among women of associations that currently exist only for men. The women's associations should federate with the men's association so as to fight together for the emancipation of labor, which alone will be able to assure independence for everyone. And this is quite a key thing for us as we argue for equal rights for men and women, with equal pay, equal equality in everything and in every sphere. And there really is a lot that has been said and we need to read. And Engels also commented on it that by men, when he's talking about working men's, it was to be implied that it included women into it. But nonetheless, this is the elaboration on that. Increasing use of machinery change the relations of capital or production, rendering workers slaves of capital. Well, new technology, robotics, IQ, intelligence, artificial intelligence, all of these are doing that today, rendering lots of people on the unemployment heap and lead them into poverty. Many handloom weavers were positively killed by the introduction of the power loom, both here in Britain and in India. And you could argue the steam train, the railways, etc., what it did back in India as well. And so finally, for trade unionists, we get this fight, the economic fight, mostly in this country, as I said, which is always for increasing wages to keep up with the cost of living. And Marx had a thing to say about this: the cry for equality of wages rests therefore upon a mistake, is an inane wish never to be fulfilled. It is an offspring of that false and superficial radicalism that accepts premises and tries to evade conclusions. In other words, for us to keep asking for wage increases rather than fixing the problem that is actually creating the misery for the masses of people is always an uphill task. It's something we're going to have to keep repeating and repeating and repeating, but we need to fix the problem. The fixation of its wages, actual degree, is only settled by the continuous struggle between capital and labor. The capitalist constantly tending to reduce wages to their physical minimum and to extend the working day to its physical maximum, while the working man or woman constantly presses in the opposite direction. And that's not changed. You have things like Manrega. We have the national minimum wage in this country, and we call it national minimum, which is hardly a living wage. And most employers say, well, we pay legally the national minimum wage, which is not the same as paying people even a living wage, never mind a fair wage. So we got a long way to go. And I think Marx fully understood it, that we got to move on to the abolition of wage slavery. Workers' right to strike, the ultimate protest of the downtrodden against the vices of our organization of society. I don't think no further needs to be said on it, really. It is the only tool we have available as trade unionists, and it's being banned as much as possible by the government, including this government in Britain today. On strike breakers, the purposes of importation of external workers is the same as that of importation of Indian coolies. Marx picked that up then. The indentured laborers to Jamaica. You don't obviously go to Jamaica. They went to so many countries, Singapore, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean. Countries have got Indian sounding names as their premiers and leaders today in that part of the world. That's because of indentured laborers. They went to work on the sugar fields and in the cotton farms. And lastly, there was a call for international cooperation, communication, and solidarity. That solidarity, and not because Swadesh Roye is there, came in the guise of people like M.K. Pandey, the former General Secretary of CITU, who visited England and in our presence went to a strike locally here at a hospital and took out whatever cash he had in his pocket to give as way of solidarity to those workers. And having emptied his wallet, then he said, as he's walking down, I want to do some shopping. We said, what is it for? I want to buy something for my wife. And he only had £5 left in his wallet because he gave the rest in solidarity to workers. That is the sort of solidarity we've had. We had solidarity from British workers to people in India when there was the Meerut conspiracy case. People were given huge sentences. It was the British Trade Union Congress, British trade unionists who came out in solidarity and said we need to reduce their sentences. It's when communists put imperialists in the dock. And then finally, I would say, we need to move towards the end to exploitation of one human by another. That was a similar slogan to the one used by Bhagat Singh when he described Inqilab Zindabad, which means long live the revolution. Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. And may I just add one thing for the people who Marx thought actually would have moved on by now to a proletarian class, to the political parties that recognized and unified everyone. Communists, you have nothing to lose but your egos. We got to get over it. We got to spread that message. We have to come together. Marx worked wonderfully well, thanks to Marcello, Professor Musto. You see him running around, attending all these meetings and all these conferences. We see him as a thinker and a professor, but I never saw him as an activist. Marx has demonstrated to us that it's equally important to be an activist and to be a thinker and a writer. And so I thank you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts on a wonderful book, which I highly recommend. Thank you.
Yes, Biraya, please guide us. How do you proceed and conclude?
After your intervention, there are some questions. I think Marcello would love to have them.
Okay.
Yes, of course. We can do for a round of questions, and both Harsev and I can do a final 2-3 minutes each to reply to the questions. So
we'll go in that case. Biraya, I'll suggest we can do this session first.
Right.
Because whatever my intervention, I look at the watch and adjust. So this important remaining session for some question answer and a few sentences of conclusion by Professor Marcello.
There is one question. Yes, Professor Marcello, there is one question. Now, why there is no international workers organization like the Communist International to guide the working class or to give certain directions? Kind of exchange between nation to nation means working class of a nation to nation. Professor Marcello.
Yes. Well, the first international was followed by many other attempts to reunite the working class also, I must say, on a global level, because of course the First International, despite the fact that at the end there were some connection with workers in Buenos Aires, in Russia, some connection with a small circle in India, letters sent to Australia. But of course, as you can imagine, the First International was mostly a European experience, right? We are historically at the middle of the 19th century. So the internationals that happened after the First International, the second one was established in 1889, 100 years after the French Revolution. As I mentioned before, this was an international of political parties, because countries like Germany, France, England, Italy, they all had already socialist, social democratic parties. So, and also the organization is spreading much more outside Europe, at least as a goal, as a necessary achievement to not confine the international only to Europe and to see. It was a little bit of the idea of progress at the time, these ideas that unilinearism that we criticize today. But of course, we have to make these documents in the historical context of the time. And I thank very, very much Harsev, because he has been able to do this extremely well. And one example was the question on gender, on women emancipation. Then there is the Third International that, as I very, very quickly mentioned in my talk, was established in 1919 after Soviet Union already exists. And of course, it had the impulse of Moscow to create a center that was, of course, around the experience of Soviet Union, but at the same time, Socialist Party, Reformist parties, they also created the Socialist International that actually exists today, right? So if we today look at the politics of social democracy, that actually is basically, unfortunately, social neoliberalism, they still have this organization. And I don't know, very important politicians like Willy Brandt, etc., they were at the head of this organization in the 20th century. Trotskyists organized the Fourth International, Chavez in Venezuela, 15 years ago, he said, we should organize a fifth international. So there was a very important moment, coming from the revolution of Venezuela and, looking at this. And Samir Amin wrote about that, Metzaros wrote about that. So from time to time, there is always a return to this question. And recently also, moderate left politicians like Varoufakis, like other like this, they called for this, transnational organization. The idea is always the same. So the problem is that, in my opinion, first of all, today we have very weak organization of labor movement, of, following, the socialist ideals. So we are not in a cycle of expansion of the working class, of labor movement, but actually it is the opposite. In some parts of the world, this connection still exists. For example, once again, moderate radical organization in Latin America, they met in the Sao Paulo Forum, right? So they have this regular meeting where they meet and discuss their politics. And, in Europe, this is happening in terms of connection among the members of European Parliament, right? So sometimes there are these forces of the so-called radical left. very often not so radical as we have seen recently, because many of this party, they were not even able to vote against the war, which is, a precondition of the history of labor movement, but they have this connection with many fights. Mélenchon, Syriza, it's very different with Tsipras, and then many other groups. I don't want to enter into details. So there is always, a request to create this. But I would say that the most important thing today will be to rebuild anti-capitalist organizations in different countries, in different experiences around the world. And only after this is happening, only after the anti-capitalist left is rethinking itself, we could conceive once again a sort of, a more serious debate around an anti-capitalist political program. Like, I don't see the possibility today of creating a center in London, in Kolkata, or in Buenos Aires, and then from there directing or giving indications for political decisions that then political parties should take in their own countries. This is becoming very difficult in the same country. My comrade Harsev ended with a polemic reference about the ego of the communists and the fact that there are so many split in the left. I don't know who was the target of this, but it is obvious. I was born in Italy, and this is the weakest moment for the Italian left, and the Italian left was the strongest communist left in Europe. And we have small groups and small parties, and they are not trying to do this operation that I mentioned at the beginning, this idea of uniting anti-capitalists around a radical program, but also being open to plurality of the ideas. And this is also a problem that you have in India after several defeats that we have been seeing, that the Indian left has been experiencing in the past years. So this question of connecting anti-capitalist forces, like it happened at the time of Karl Marx, is, from one point of view, in my opinion, something that can no longer exist in that way. Because, as I mentioned before, now that political parties exist all over the world, it was inconceivable to, respond and to have a sort of obedience for decisions that are taken somewhere else. The question would be to learn from the different experiences, right, that are happening around the world, and to have permanent moment of connections, and also to have political parties or political organization. Learn is also something that is related to social movements, right? Not only to political parties. And also, trade unions have connections internationally, as you know very well. But this is something that can happen only after there is a strong refoundation of the anti-capitalist left, and a need for internationalism. Because in this historical moment, in this historical period, I would say that labor movement is more international than capital. So we started this idea of, international politics in this way. Today, on the contrary, capitalism is more international than labor movement after globalization, etc. And we are actually being defeated because of this. But the first task, the first goal is to rebuild, and from some point of view, significantly rethink, not only from the point of view of theory, but also of political organization, the anti-capitalist forces. And only once this is done and accomplished, we can have moment of political connection and a decision that is shared. Because we all know and we all believe that if we want to face very complicated task that we have today as left or as anti-capitalist movement, one for all ecology, this is not something that we can, discuss, think, and change on a national scale. So there is a need about this, but we should do this without entering into dogmatic mechanism that, would say, for example, the center has voted 60% in favor of this and all the parties should do this. Because as Marx said, ideas, political strategies that are good for India today are not good for Canada today, or political ideas and strategies, or even tactical movements that were good in India in the 1950s are not good in India today in 2022. So this level of flexibility around political strategy is something that we should also keep in mind.
Yeah, one more question to Marcello. This is related to the idea of united tactics. The two levels of united tactics: at the level of idea, theory, and arriving at a common point. The other idea of united tactics is at the level of praxis. So how do you see in terms of, because he mentioned in Gotha program, he refers to the experiences he had during organizing the first international, about organizing different streams, different stands, as you mentioned in the initial part of your lecture.
I will try to make this very, very quick. And, these are questions that could take a lot of time. And I see that we have only 5 minutes left. I'm going to make an example that was actually mentioned by Harsev in his excellent presentation. And the example is Karl Marx in front of this idea of minimum wage, or the idea of, giving a sort of basic income to people, particularly the first topic, because actually at the end of his life in 1880, Marx was called by French Socialist Party to contribute to their political program. So the International is 1864, but it took more than 15 years for Marx to enter in France and to have, if not an hegemonic position, but a strong position in front of all the other socialism that existed at the time. I mentioned, Proudhon, I mentioned Fourier, Saint-Simon, Blanqui. There were many thinkers, different kind of socialism. So Marx at the end of his life is called to participate, to help French socialists in the sense of, North American center. So when I say socialist in this sense, I mean, radical. At the time, Socialist Party were also party where revolutionary people were. This is before 1917 revolution and, the beginning of Communist Party. Well, Marx is very much against this question of minimum wage, because Marx is very worried about this question, like minimum wage could become a maximum wage. Marx is mentioning this to the leaders of the party. Marx is mentioning this to his daughter in a letter. Marx is discussing this with Engels. So this is perhaps a question between theory and practice, and this is also something that we could connect to our political situation today. It is useful to improve life of millions of human beings, and the forces of the left, the mild, moderate left, and also the so-called radical left that today is actually a social democracy, right? If we compare with the position of the time, they are both fighting in many countries in favor of minimum wage. And this is certainly good if this is helping millions of human beings living in a decent way or in a better way. But Marx is worried, as it was said before me, exactly about this, that the idea of the abolition of wage labor, that the idea of abolition of capitalism, that is the only way to end the slavery of the working class. And we can add today that is the only way to save planet from the destruction because of ecology and all the other issues. Well, there is a risk that this is forgotten, and that this idea about fair wage, as has been said before me, or minimum wage, is the only flag of the labor movement, is the only flag of the trade union, is the only struggle that they're doing. So Marx, as a thinker, and here you can see theory and praxis, he is strongly arguing against this, against in the sense like, this cannot be the final idea of labor movement. Tactically, we can fight for this, but we should put in the head of working class people, we should fight for, class consciousness in order to understand that a wage that is paid $1 more per hour does nothing against the fact that today few human beings makes more money than half of the world, half of the humanity. This incredible thing. So this is something that we should always put at the center of our political program, even when we are fighting for smaller, that sometimes are important struggles and points.
Yeah, Comrade Harsev, you want to join? Any additional insights?
No, thanks. I think Professor Musto has really summed them up, and I think we leave it to Comrade Roye now.
Yeah,
to say whatever he needs to. But thank you,
Comrade Devrai, you are concluding.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Now, looking at the watch and the time in India, certainly I should be cautious about the time factor, and surely I am not to take more than a few minutes. First of all, I express my thanks and gratitude for the organizer, for Professor Marcello and Comrade Benz, for getting this opportunity to listen to you, and for Biraiya for inviting me in this occasion. And it is not only my personal gratitude, I am also thankful on behalf of both of my organization, my parent organization, Center of Indian Trade Unions, and my responsibility as the Deputy General Secretary of World Federation of Trade Union. And certainly in my forthcoming meeting of the Secretariat of WFTU on 8th of November at Athens, I shall share this experience of mine. I would like to demonstrate a little bit of audacity here and say that WFTU, in terms of its political, ideological perspective and persuasion, should not be exaggeration to say that it is a continuation of the Working Men Association's documentation, perspective, goal, etc., etc. And I have used the word audacity. Of course, WFTU has had its ups and downs, and everybody present over here knows the WFTU in the Foundation Conference India was duly represented. And for me personally, ever since CI2 was associated with the WFTU in different capacity, different angles from the beginning, but when really CI2 was born, and subsequently when CI2 was formally affiliated to WFTU, I'm continuing as one of its Deputy General Secretary. Okay, that's it. Now about the occasion, the book Workers Unite. When I was asked to join this, naturally it was a bounding duty for me to locate the book and at least turn the pages. I should not be totally blank. I cannot claim that I have read everything, particularly due to paucity of time, because I could locate the book by downloading for the online and that getting some printout also. But last about 10 days or so, I have been very intensively traveling within the country in course of my different responsibilities. But during the time when I had some traveling, I had time to read this book also. Well, I have seen the chapters, the arrangement, etc., etc. The 13 chapter, 80 topics, out of which 30 the Marcello has written itself. The 30 has been authored by Marx himself, and in the rest, he is the co-authors. So all this arrangement I have gone through. I have certainly read the preface word by word. I have turned the pages of the introduction, which itself is a brief and precise, rousing history of the International Working Men's Association. So reading this, it will be really shining and vividly refreshing the memory. It's a great job done by Professor Marcello, I must say. And particularly about the lineup of the 80 items or documents. In his preface, he has said that when it was celebration of 100 years of Working Men's Association, that was a different time, and today it is a different time. And keeping the present situation, the challenges before us and the path forward, he has lined up the documents. That is excellent. And really, I have revisited some of the documents in this book. And if you kindly take me by my words, I have already got a spiral binding with me, and I shall continue to carry it with me within the country abroad till I reread and read the old documents, the vivid introduction and other things. That is I think, since I don't have time. And finally, allow me to share that while celebrating the 100 years of Soviet Revolution or first socialist revolution of the world, I had occasion to pen down a small booklet under the title May Day to October Revolution, the Glorious Struggle of the Working Class, 1886-1917. And in that book, I had a chapter about Marx, Engels, and First and Second International. So on that occasion, I had reason, I had necessity to go to some documents, not that vividly as he has done. I don't venture to say like that. So there, about the situation today, we can say with pride, enthusiasm, and great encouragement. And all of you are much better informed, read about Marxism, that there is nothing, even after 150 years of the Working Men Association documentation, etc., what was said in those documents, what could foresee, and what is happening really in some and substance, politically, ideologically, there is no difference. It is a kind of total, corroboration of the Marx and this thing. Say, for example, the present crisis, which I'll conclude. In his inaugural address to the First Working Men Association, Marx said that no improvement of machinery, no appliance of science to production, no contrivances of communications, no new economies, no immigration, no opening of market, no free trade, nothing of the kind can solve the crisis, and it shall rather more frequently repeat. That's what Marx said in that inaugural address. Well, in the 1890, first May Day celebration in London. After that, in one of his writings, Engels wrote about the vividness of the first celebration, etc., etc. And he concluded, he lamented, if Marx would have been alive today, he would have seen the workers of the world unite, etc., etc. Today, I had ventured to say that if Marx would have been alive today, he would have seen that we have reached to a situation that crisis of capitalism is no longer cyclical. It is a crisis of the systemic crisis. Right from 1930 or before that crisis came, and they continued for a shorter or longer duration, and they could find some solution. But this, up till now, certainly they have not been found any solution, and I do not know when, if at all, it is possible or so. The current systemic crisis of capitalism has got a specialty. It took up in America, immediately prior to entire Europe. There are so many other significant. So therefore, Marx said so, and today we see so. And therefore, so far as the trade union movement is concerned, WF2 and my own organization, we totally believe and pursue and follow what Marx said in manifesto itself, that workers are not to avoid day-to-day struggle, then they will be escaping their responsibility on one end. But if they rely so much on the capitalist system, they'll be deceiving themselves. So balance has to be. Day-to-day struggle is a must, but it must be linked to the perspective. That is the understanding of Marx, CITO follows, and my own organization also, plus the World Federation of Trade Union. In this way we work. So therefore, that is the trade union understanding. So as I promised, I have taken about 6 minutes. I must, whether I want or not, I must call it a day. And I once again thank to Professor Marcello, Comrade Harsev, and Comrade Biraya for providing me the opportunity to be a part of this presentation and listen to them. Certainly, I shall try to carry forward the message of this presentation, and I am committed that the book Workers Unite, I'll certainly continue to read, because I have seen, he has said that he has selected the documents in such a way that in today's challenging context, how to forward, that will be really motivating the documents. So not only I shall read, I shall appeal to each one, those who believe in class struggle, those who believe in Marxism, those who believe in trade union movement in the perspective of class struggle and class. So therefore, it is a must. With this, I thank you all, and I conclude, and kindly permit me to say, looking at the Indian time, good night to you all.
Before closing the session, I want to make a small announcement. As
Please.
Due to time differences, so many people who wished to join the talk could not do so. So I request all of them to go through the talk in our Manchi Pusthakam YouTube, which is there as a live. So you are welcome to follow the talk. With these remarks, thank you once again to all for accepting the invitation from Mana.